against because of community, and they are also discriminated very specifically because of the patriarchy within the Muslim community in India. That is the patriarchy of their own community. The state, instead of having programs or affirmative action directly for the Muslim women within the community, prefers to deal with the conservative Muslim leadership that represents a monolith. So that has also prevented the democratization within the Muslim community. So these are some of the complexities that we face. Such are avoided looking at either the gender dimension or the security dimension. Now coming to Article 14 and Article 21. The socio-economic backwardness of the largest Indian minority is matched also by the socio-economic backwardness of India's Christians, who are a much smaller number. The national average, the Christian community in India, if you include Dalit and Christians, would be close to 3.6%. Today, Dalit Christians are not counted in the totaling up, so it comes to about 2.7%. But either way, it's a very small minority, and the socio-economic condition of a large section, almost 87% of India's Christians, is no better than India's Muslims. So certain institutional discrimination and a societal discrimination is at work. There has to be an admission of that before we can work towards a correction of that. And one would like to say that India is constantly, I think, battling a situation where we are proud to be the world's largest democracy. We are proud that we have, except for a few years during the emergency, maintained a democratic framework, had regular elections and all that it means. But what India is battling all the time is to preserve the structural and visionary promise it made to itself on 26th of January 1950, which was to become a secular, democratic, egalitarian republic. And a serious threat to it since 1986 and even today remains the politics of majoritarian communalism that wishes to superimpose and then transform the nature of this republic from a secular democratic one to something else. And this is the battle that is still being fought, and that is why we see a situation on the ground where the position of religious minorities is what it is today. Now, I have spent some time trying to outline the socio-economic differentials and the discriminations faced by the religious minorities. I'd like to come specifically now to the life and security threat. Article 14 and Article 21, where communal violence comes into play. Where communal violence, having explained the term to you, I'd like to say that targeted violence against a section of people because they belong to a certain religious denomination comes into play. Now, the history of communal violence, and I have studied some of this even pre-partition. I've studied it a little bit in Bangladesh, much more in Sri Lanka. I just like to also posit here very, very clearly for our discussion purposes that identity-based violence and communal violence happens in all communities. Many communities perpetrate it. It's not just one community in India that is perpetrating it. But the greatest threat to minority rights is from majoritarian targeted violence. Which is not to say that minority communalisms and minority-driven violence also does not happen either in retaliatory form or in provocative form. The very nature of identity-based violence means that if you create a situation where people begin to see their consciousness as a religious minority or a majority, they start reacting like that rather than as individuals or part of another collective. So there is some failure somewhere where we are not able to, even today, I mean what happened in Kishtwar last week, I'd like to refer to, it's very complex, it's very, very complex. One has been talking repeatedly to different groups and different people living in Poonch, Kishwar, Jammu Valley. It's a manifestation of this. It's a complex issue, and one of the unfortunate realities which India will have to accept is the failure of the rule of law to contain, to prevent violence, even before you contain it, to prevent violence, to contain it, and to prosecute it. To prosecute it promptly has led to a situation of spiraling and continued kind of this thing where you can, it's like the chicken and egg situation, you don't know what started it and what then completes the whole cycle. Now, what are the issues that the rule of law in operation needs to look at in terms of prevention? How does communal violence build up? Historically, I can even go back to pre-47, but I'd like to start with 1961, where we had our first bout of inter-community violence in Jabalpur. And a small incident coming after many, many years of relative peace after the brutalities of the what happened in Bihar, Bengal and Punjab when the subcontinent was partitioned, suddenly took national importance, and it's very important to see how that incident was played out in the national consciousness. Jabalpur, I'm talking about, we can look at Jabalpur, we can look at Ranchi, we can look at Muradabad, and the important thing to remember is that communal violence has got this unique characteristic of somehow tainting the entire scenario around, and unless you have extraordinary ability at that time to remain non-partisan, whether you're a journalist, whether you're a chronicler, whether you're a superintendent of police of that district, it tends to engulf you into identity politics. So what began as a intra-community marriage between a BD worker who happened to be a Muslim to a Hindu girl who was from a quote-unquote upper echelons of society was replayed in the national consciousness as an abduction of a Hindu girl by a Muslim boy, until one young reporter at that time, who was one of our foremost journalists thereafter, Mr. S.B. Kolpe, till he went down from Bombay and actually met the SP, who was a Kashmiri Pandit, who said, no, this is an RSS mouthpiece that is misleading this propaganda. In reality, it was nothing but a love affair between two people who are majors, and it's got nothing to do with abduction. Then he started writing in Free Press Journal, and the entire story got reversed. So whether it is Jabalpur, Ranchi, Bombay 92-93, Kandhamal or Gujarat, the failure of the rule of law, because we are talking about the use of law, the failure of the rule of law lies in not picking up the signals of tensions building up before the outbreak of violence. And therefore I've written a lot on this academically, and I've said who cast the first stone is the whole myth about communal violence. Because the communal violence does not begin when the first stone is cast, physical stone is cast. For months before, there is a certain mobilization going on. And this mobilization, more often than not, happens through hate speech and hate writing. And what do I mean by hate speech and hate writing? I mean provocative writing that violates in Indian law sections 153A, 153B, 295 of the CRPC, 153A, 153B of the Indian Penal Code, and 505 of the Indian Penal Code. Now, what are these sections of the law? These sections of the law essentially are certain restraints put on Article 19, which is free speech. Article 19 under the Constitution has Article 19(2), which says reasonable safeguards on free speech need to be in place. 153A, 153B, 295 and 505 are recognitions that we are living in a very diverse, plural, multilingual, multi-religious, a very plural society. So while I have the freedom of speech, and I should respect that freedom, and you should respect my freedom, if I abuse that freedom to abuse a section of people to the extent that can generate violence towards them, then there is a bar on free speech. So for instance, for example, I can give you some very, very important examples from Hindu communal organizations, Muslim communal organizations, Christian communal organizations that distribute certain kind of literature that are meant to create a possibility of violence under those sections. That is when the law is supposed to start operating. And then you're supposed to book a case against those individuals, the publishers or the speech givers of such hate speech or hate writing, and you're supposed to prosecute them. Now, our experience all these years has been that unfortunately the law turns a blind eye to hate writing and hate speech. We had one very, very important judgment coming out of the Delhi courts in the early 1990s in a case where a publication calling itself Mother India, when you have Mother India, Bharat Mata, these are very, very, very suspicious constructs because they are meant to kind of invoke an extremely majoritarian, sectarian sense of nationhood, which is Hindu and upper caste. In fact, one of the criticisms of the speech made by Narendra Modi day before yesterday, I don't know how many of you on Facebook or whatever, is that he never uses the word Jai Hind, either before a speech or after a speech. He will never talk about actually saluting the Indian tricolour because he believes in a very sectarian and majoritarian ideology which would rather talk about Bharat Mata and a sense of Indian nationhood which is exclusivist based on, Golwalkar's notion that, Muslims, Christians, communists, atheists are the greatest dangers to this sense of nation. So coming back to what I was saying, the lack of prosecution or the absence of the rule of law operating when it comes to the build-up to communal violence is one of the reasons why communal violence has happened in such a systematic, regular and widespread manner. Now, ironically, our judicial commissions of inquiry have recognized this, have stated this, but somehow or the other, we have not been able to engage in healthy prosecutions. Now, 92-93. Before that, Bhiwandi in 1965 to 1970, after Jabalpur happens, you had the Shiv Sena being born in Maharashtra. You had the Shiv Sena being born in a very aggressive, first anti-South Indian platform, anti-Gujarati platform, then that turning into an anti-Muslim platform. And all the speeches made by the leaders are violative of the sections that I have mentioned to you. Even what happened with Biharis in Maharashtra 4 years ago, or 5 years ago under the MNS, was violative of the rule of law. It's not simply a religious chauvinism, it's also an anti-linguistic. And it was people from Bihar and North India who were attacked in Maharashtra. And yet the rule of law did not start operating.